Good evening, America. Tonight, the most powerful peace envoys in the United States government flew to one of the wealthiest and most influential nations in the Middle East. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, two of the men most responsible for constructing every aspect of this peace process, touched down in Doha, Qatar, ready for talks. And Iran's delegation was also in Doha at the same time, in the same city. And the two delegations refused to be in the same room. They refused to share a building. They are talking to Qatar's prime minister separately, passing messages through intermediaries, staying carefully, deliberately, demonstrably far apart from each other. One day after Trump posted on Truth Social in all capital letters that Iran has requested a meeting, Iran's own foreign ministry spokesperson went on camera and said, "We will not have any negotiation meetings at any level with the American side in the coming days. And the fact that the U.S. representatives are traveling to Qatar has nothing to do with the visit of the Iranian delegation. Nothing to do with it. The same city, the same week. Nothing to do with it." And while all of this was unfolding in Doha, the Wall Street Journal reported that Trump has been considering in multiple conversations with his War Secretary, Pete Hegseth, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a complete return to all-out war with Iran. Tonight, we are breaking down every single piece of this extraordinary diplomatic theater, what is actually happening between these two delegations, why Iran struck a Qatari oil tanker during the exact same weekend. It was thanking Qatar for being its most trusted mediator, why J.D. Vance says America holds all the cards, and why the man who has been managing this entire war is now privately weighing the option of abandoning the deal entirely and resuming full-scale military operations. Stay with me, because tonight reveals more about the true state of this peace process than any press conference or signing ceremony has told you yet. Let us start with what actually happened in Doha today, because the specific details of how this meeting was structured, or rather how it was deliberately structured to not be a meeting at all, are genuinely revealing. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, Trump's lead negotiators, arrived in Doha and met with Qatar's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman bin Jassim Al Thani. That meeting happened. It was confirmed. It was photographed. An Iranian delegation also arrived in Doha this week. Iran's own Foreign Minister Esmail Baghaei confirmed the delegation's presence. He said the Iranian officials would be in Qatar for 2 days to discuss the status of $6 billion of frozen Iranian assets currently held in Doha, and to review American progress toward implementing the provisions of the Memorandum of Understanding. But he was emphatic about one thing. The Iranian delegation's role is to discuss America's implementation progress with the Qatari mediators. Not with the American delegation, the Iranians would discuss what America is doing with the Qataris. America's team would separately discuss the same issues with the same Qataris. Qatar would carry messages in both directions. At no point would American and Iranian officials actually sit across a table from each other in the same room at the same time. That is the structure of today's diplomacy on day 122 of this war. Not bilateral talks, not proximity talks where delegations are in adjacent rooms with messages passed through a mediator. Two separate visiting teams in the same city explicitly refusing to acknowledge that the other team's visit has anything at all to do with their own. And here is the specific legal argument Iran is making for why it refuses to negotiate further right now. And it is the clearest and most technically detailed version of Iran's position this channel has yet covered. Iran's Foreign Minister Baghaei was precise about this today. He cited Clause 13 of the memorandum directly and said Iran and the United States have not yet entered the stage of negotiating a final agreement, because under that clause, final agreement talks can only begin after implementation has started on clauses 1, 4, 5, 10, and 11 of the signed document, and those provisions must continue to be carried out. Let us look at what each of those clauses requires. Clause 1 calls for an immediate and permanent end to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon. Clause 4 addresses the removal of the American naval blockade. Clause 5 addresses toll-free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Clause 10 addresses Lebanon specifically. Clause 11 covers the release of frozen Iranian assets. Iran is saying that none of those 5 foundational clauses have been fully implemented, and therefore Clause 13, which would authorize moving to final agreement negotiations, has simply not been triggered yet. Iran is not walking away from the deal. Iran is saying America has not fulfilled enough of its own obligations under the deal to unlock the next phase of talks. The Trump administration's response to this position, delivered by White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, was direct. She said, "As far as we're concerned, we're holding up our end of the ceasefire." She warned that violence will be met with violence if Iran attacks commercial ships or American interests. And Vice President Vance made the boldest claim yet about America's negotiating position. Speaking to reporters Monday, Vance declared that the United States holds all the cards in negotiations with Iran, arguing the Trump administration is in a win-win position. He said if Iran agrees to a genuine peace, it gets relief and reconstruction. If Iran does not agree, America continues military pressure. Vance's framing presents maximum leverage and no downside. But here is the question his framing does not answer. If America holds all the cards, how does a signed peace deal produce a situation where Iran's delegation refuses to be in the same building as the American team during talks in a third country? There is one detail from this weekend's exchange of fire that deserves direct and pointed attention tonight, because it reveals exactly how chaotic and potentially self-defeating this entire period has been from a diplomatic standpoint. Over the weekend, as this channel reported, Iran launched attacks in the Strait of Hormuz that struck multiple vessels. One of those vessels was a tanker carrying Qatari crude oil. Iran struck a Qatari oil tanker. Qatar is simultaneously Iran's single most important diplomatic mediator. The country whose prime minister is right now sitting in Doha shuttling messages between America's team and Iran's team. The country without whose active cooperation the entire peace process would have no functioning channel at all. And Iran hit one of Qatar's own oil tankers during the same weekend. Qatar's response to being struck was to condemn the attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain publicly and to stress the need to spare the region from unjustified attacks, while simultaneously preparing to host both delegations in Doha this week. That extraordinary combination of grievance and continued engagement tells you something important about Qatar's role in this process. Doha has absorbed a direct hit to its own economic assets and chosen to continue mediating anyway because Qatar has concluded that the alternative, a return to full-scale war, is worse for Qatari interests than the cost of a damaged tanker. Now let us turn to the Wall Street Journal report, because this is the development that has received insufficient attention in today's coverage of the Doha diplomacy, and which deserves to be heard directly. The Wall Street Journal reported Tuesday that Trump has held multiple conversations in recent days with War Secretary Pete Hegseth and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane about conducting more strikes against Iran. Multiple conversations in recent days with the country's top military official and the head of America's armed forces about more strikes, while Kushner and Witkoff are in Doha meeting with Qatar's prime minister and trying to preserve a peace deal. That is the full picture of where this administration is right now. The diplomatic track and the military track are running simultaneously in the same building at the top levels of the American government, and the president himself is the one sitting at the center of both tracks, deciding from one moment to the next which one to pursue. The Journal report specifically said Trump is considering a return to all-out war with Iran. Not targeted strikes, not defensive actions, all-out war. The same language that would have described the opening of this conflict on February 28th, when 900 strikes hit Iran in 12 hours. The possibility that America returns to that scale of military operation is now being discussed at the presidential level, according to the Wall Street Journal's sourcing. At the same time, Kushner is sipping tea with Qatar's prime minister in Doha. It is worth pausing here to look at what this pattern of simultaneous military and diplomatic tracks has actually produced over the course of this entire war, because the history is instructive. Throughout this conflict, every previous round of talk about returning to all-out war has functioned either as genuine preparation for resumed strikes or as diplomatic pressure designed to force Iran toward the negotiating table. In the early days of this war, Trump's unconditional surrender demand was followed by ceasefire negotiations. Trump's multiple threats to resume bombing have been followed by new rounds of talks. Even this weekend's actual exchange of strikes appears to have produced a stand down for now and a parallel diplomatic visit to Doha within 48 hours. The cycle of threat, strike, stand down, negotiate, threat again has been so consistent throughout this conflict that it is now possible to watch it unfold in real time and predict approximately what comes next. The question this journal report raises is whether this particular cycle will break from the pattern, whether Trump will decide that the deal as currently constituted is not delivering what he promised the American people, and whether he will choose the all-out war option rather than continuing to accept a peace process in which Iran refuses to sit in the same room as his own envoys. Let us bring you the complete current state of the Strait of Hormuz, because this is where the most concrete, measurable evidence of progress or failure actually shows up. According to maritime risk consultancy Maersk's CEO Dimitris Maniatis, speaking to CNN, the Strait of Hormuz remains the principal flashpoint, but also the principal focus of ongoing negotiations. He said Washington and Tehran have demonstrated a willingness to retaliate while simultaneously preserving the diplomatic track. He assessed that as long as dialogue continues, there remains a realistic window of opportunity for commercial transits under carefully managed conditions, but cautioned that the security environment remains fragile and capable of changing with little warning. Traffic through the waterway is still at a fraction of its pre-war levels. The central route remains closed due to mines. Ships are using the southern route, hugging the Omani coast. The UKMTO, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Authority, which provides security guidance to commercial vessels operating in this region, raised its maritime security threat level for the Strait of Hormuz to substantial, warning of elevated risk from floating sea mines. Substantial is the second highest of the 5 threat levels this body uses. That is not a signal of a strait that is safely reopened for international commerce. That is a warning that the world's most important oil shipping lane remains actively dangerous more than 4 months after this war began. Iran's chief negotiator Ghalibaf, the same official who mocked American claims about frozen assets buying American soybeans just days ago, said something today that deserves direct mention because it reveals Iran's current framing of its own position in these negotiations. He said Iran is currently selling its oil at prices 20% higher than before the war began. He said sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz rests with Iran and Oman. And he warned that if the United States seeks to prevent Iran from selling its oil, no one will benefit from oil. That last statement is a specific targeted economic threat. If America tries to block Iranian oil sales, Iran is saying it has the ability and the willingness to make sure no oil moves through the strait for anyone. Iran's oil is currently selling at a 20% premium over pre-war prices, meaning the disruption to global supply chains created by this war has actually increased the per-barrel value of the oil Iran is managing to sell. From Iran's economic perspective, a world where it sells less oil at a 20% markup may actually be more profitable than a world where it sells more oil at the pre-war market price. There is one more detail from today that captures the full absurdity and the full tragedy of this moment simultaneously. Kurdish separatists are attempting to cross from Iraq into Iran's west amid a wave of domestic protests inside Iran itself, according to reporting cited by Fox News. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is now simultaneously managing an external war with the United States and Israel, a diplomatic crisis in Doha, a standoff over who gets to run the Strait of Hormuz, and a resurgent internal threat from Kurdish insurgents in its own territory who are reportedly taking advantage of the war's disruption to attempt crossings that would have been far more difficult before the country's military was degraded by 4 months of American and Israeli strikes. That combination of pressures, external conflict, diplomatic isolation, and domestic insurgency is precisely the vulnerability this war was supposed to create inside Iran. And yet here we are on day 122, with Iran still refusing to sit in the same room as the American delegation, still refusing to engage in what it considers premature final agreement talks, and still claiming strategic victories in the very negotiations it is attending by refusing to attend them. Here is the complete picture as of tonight, June 30th, 2026, day 122 of this war. Kushner and Witkoff flew to Doha and met with Qatar's prime minister. Iran's delegation arrived in Doha at the same time and refused to meet with the American team, insisting the two visits have nothing to do with each other. Iran says 5 foundational clauses of the MOU, including Lebanon, frozen assets, and toll-free Strait passage, must be implemented before final negotiations can begin. The White House says America is holding up its end of the deal and warns violence will be met with violence. Vance says America holds all the cards in a win-win position. The Wall Street Journal reports Trump has been holding multiple conversations with military leaders about a possible return to all-out war with Iran. The UKMTO has raised the Hormuz threat level to substantial overfloating sea mines. Iran hit a Qatari oil tanker over the weekend, while Qatar continued to mediate for Iran. Iran's chief negotiator says Iran is selling oil at a 20% markup and warns no one will benefit from oil if America tries to stop Iranian sales. Kurdish insurgents are attempting crossings in Iran's west amid domestic protests, and $6 billion of frozen Iranian assets remain in Doha, not yet officially released, disputed by all 3 governments simultaneously in 3 completely different ways. America, here is my question for you tonight. On day 122 of this war, Trump's own peace envoys flew to Qatar today. Iran's own delegation was in the same city at the same time. And the 2 teams refused to be in the same building. Kushner and Witkoff are talking to Qatar. Iran is talking to Qatar. Qatar is passing messages in both directions. And the Wall Street Journal says Trump is privately weighing a return to all-out war, even as this diplomatic theater plays out. Here is what I want to know from you. At what point does refusing to talk in the same room become indistinguishable from refusing to talk at all? And if Iran and America cannot even agree on which city's conference table to share, do you believe this peace deal has any realistic chance of surviving the next 30 days of its 60-day negotiating window? Drop your answer in the comments right now, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There are 30 days left in this memorandum's implementation window, and we will be here with you for every single one of them.